Now, I made a conscious decision to start with, as it were, a voice of youth. First-time buyers have been really hard hit by the meltdown in the mortgage market, and in so many ways, they are, of course, the future. So I scratched my little head and thought of Lettice Bromovsky, who's a political commentator and who I talked to back in the summer about the Conservative leadership race, and she made it pretty clear where she stood. She is a free marketeer and is all for economic liberalism. Welcome back, and I'm glad you could fit us in.
Hello, Alastair.
It's a troubling one, because you can read any number of newspapers and you'll get very, very different views. But this is supposed to be the budget that will economically liberate, because it's for economic liberals like yourself. Low tax, small state, get out there and get on with it. It's gone down like a Led Zeppelin.
It has, completely agree with that. However, the economic principles, the core economic principles at the centre of this, I fully support, and they should be supported by many. What Liz Truss is trying to do is she's challenging this economic orthodoxy that we've seen, particularly since the financial crash in 2008, where we've had very high quantitative easing methods coupled with very low interest rate.
That's pumping a lot of cash into the economy.
And sort of creating
as much as anything after the crash in 2007-8.
Yeah, exactly. And creating this sort of phony sense of growth. But since then, we've had, 1% growth each year, and we've got, because of COVID, a massive bill of about £500 billion. This has to be challenged with real, substantial and sustainable growth. And that's what this budget, I think, will do. However, as you say, it's gone down like a bit of a lead balloon.
OK, pause there, and I'm going to put exactly the same question to Julian Jessup, who's coming on in a moment. How is it supposed to work? How is it supposed to generate, frankly, a modest ambition of 2.5% growth, which used to be the kind of norm, by taking the cap off bankers' bonuses, by cutting away that top rate of 45%, but only giving the vast majority of people a penny off income tax and reversing the national insurance increase? How is that supposed to suddenly kickstart this economy?
Well, I think the idea that this is only a budget for the rich people is entirely is a gross misconception, really. What we're seeing, particularly with taking the cap off bankers' bonuses, there is still a cap in the Eurozone. So bankers from Europe will come over to us, and those bonuses, they're always going to be taxed, so they will be getting more money in from that. On top of that, the largest sum in this budget was the energy price cap, which was about 60 billion roundabout, and that's helping every single person in this country deal with their energy bills. Yes, the 1p off wasn't as high as some people hoped for. There is another sort of mini budget, as you can say, coming very soon. And hopefully, I'm hoping to see a few things. Maybe a cut in VAT would be something I would want to see on that next budget. But I think that there is a real chance here, if you bring down that top rate of tax, there is more investment for entrepreneurial spirit, perhaps, and people are more likely to throw themselves into risk and opportunity. And we've got, from previous empirical evidence from 2014, when George Osborne brought down that top rate of tax from 50 to 45, it did bring in a high...
I don't dispute that. I mean, really, it was the scale that I was slightly concerned about. But you said earlier on in that answer about the level of debt that was troubling, that needed to be dealt with. That stuff I just read out about energy bills, which you praise quite rightly, and so do I, and so does everybody else who's picking up some of that. You know, that's going to add another 100+ billion to that debt.
Yes.
The income tax... They wouldn't even sit down with the Office for Budget Responsibility and say, if we do this, that will happen.
Yeah.
I mean, I have never in all my years seen a government flying blind.
That was a total error on the government's part, and I completely agree with that. The communication that we have seen over this last week has been so poor and has had such a massive impact on the volatility of the markets. From when it was announced last Friday to then Kwarteng on Sunday coming out and saying... No, he didn't convince the markets at all. When you're trying to challenge the Treasury orthodoxy like they're saying, you need to bring people along with you. You need to have that confidence. Yeah. And we saw the absolute horror car crash that was Liz Truss's interviews that happened yesterday. I mean, it seemed like she didn't even know what was going on, let alone what her budget had said. And even to the point when she was asked about fracking, I think, in Lancashire, BBC Radio, you could hear the sort of rustle of papers from her aides. I mean, this is ridiculous. We need greater confidence, and that comes through communication. And really, the government's got to step it up a lot in order to convince people that this is the right direction.
You observe economics closely, and you observe politics even more closely. Is this the Rishi Sunak camp saying, told you so, and rocking the boat? Because when we talked before about the leadership election, it was crystal clear what Truss would do if she won, and she's done it. And it was crystal clear what Rishi would do if he won, and that would be to encourage the Bank of England to up interest rates even higher than they are right now to curb inflation. He's hardly said a word, but lots of his chums have. Are they sitting there saying, no, I told you?
Well, I think I sort of hate that argument in many ways because I find it's kind of redundant and unhelpful. I do believe that if Rishi Sunak was in power, we would be in probably a worse off position than we are now. Rishi Sunak was purely the continuation of Boris Johnson, and it wasn't going anywhere, and we needed that real bold change. Like I remember when I was last on here with you, we need a change of direction to get away from this sort of low-growth stagnation. We forget so easily where we were just a few months ago with the fear of recession looming, the energy bills, war in Ukraine. Everything was sort of tumbling down around us. We had to change, and it takes dramatic change to get away from where we were then.
Final point. We did a GB People's poll over the last few days. And like all of the other polls at the moment, it shows Labour top 40, round about 50, and the Tories down below 30. And there's a pattern emerging there. But I spotted within it something that I wanted to put to you directly, having given you that intro, as it were. There's only about 5 to 7% of your generation who'd consider voting Conservative now. And this budget is supposed to be about your future, about your first time buying, about the interest rate you'll pay, getting a house, getting a job and seeing the economy get back to better times. 5 to 7% of your generation buy it.
Yeah, I feel that seems dismally low, and it's not necessarily my personal experience of it. However, I think it speaks to the wider issue of disillusionment amongst the young with politics on the whole. You know, they feel like they're not being heard and their voices aren't being included in budgets like this, for example, and you need more to support the next generation. So I don't think there's necessarily a swing that those other 95% are going to Labour. I think just many are a bit like, we need better change, or we need better direction, perhaps.
All right. And any opinion poll's only a snapshot of what's happening right now. Tomorrow could be entirely different. Exactly. I've asked you to do two things. One is stay where you are and listen to Alan Duncan, who's up next, and then Julian Jessup, and give your thoughts on what they have to say. And then come back at 1 o'clock and we'll have a further natter. But for the time being, Lettice, thank you very much indeed. Lettice Bromovsky, their political commentator, and as I say, she will be back in the show. And former cabinet minister. I said Lettice would be back after both of my guests had spoken, but I've going to bring her in straight away. A, because that was a lovely thumbs up from Sir Alan for your analysis. But his killer point is not now. Why do it now when the market's not ready for it, when the economy's not ready for it? And as Alan said, the world of politics wasn't really ready for it either.
Well, completely. And he definitely has a point there. But it goes back to my point that there's sort of never a good time to completely reform this whole thing. I bring it up, for example, in 1981, when Margaret Thatcher introduced her 1981 budget. At the time, again, that went against all the economic sort of consensus that had been going since the post-war period. And in fact, 364 economists wrote in saying this is going to be entirely ruinous for the fiscal and monetary policy. And yet that was sort of the cornerstone now, when we look back in hindsight, of the boom that proceeded in the 1980s. And I'm not saying that that's exactly what this is going to be, but I think that although there's a lot of critical evidence, that core economic principles remain the same, and that's what's going to give us growth.
All right, Lettice. I'm going to say it bluntly, and he won't mind my saying it, because I suspect he's still hearing. A lot more blunt than I expected. I thought he would be universally defensive of it. He recognises there were quite profound errors made. Yeah,
definitely, and there were significant errors made. I think one point that he made there, which I thought was very interesting, is that this is a global issue. All we've seen a lot in the media is this cycle of it being very UK-focused, very doom and gloom about the pound going down. But we've got to remember that although the pound came close to parity with the dollar, the euro actually slipped below it on Tuesday to, I think, 0.97, 0.98, something like that.
And the implication from him very clearly, that the Bank of England should have acted sooner, faster, rather than
100%.
dabbling at the edge of it. Lettice, still come back at 1 o'clock. Lots for you to reflect upon. I see you've completed one side of A4. I'm sure there'll be more later on. Great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. So Alan Duncan there and Julian Jessup. Great lineup, and Lettice at the beginning and commentating on it throughout. You are watching and listening to Alastair Stewart and indeed Friends, with lots more coming up on today's programme. Utterly catastrophic from a former cabinet minister who clearly, Lettice, I asked you to pop back in, and you have done. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, Alan comes from a slightly different wing of the party, but on a number of issues, social issues, he's as libertarian as you are. Can Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng claw their way back from that kind of judgment from a former cabinet minister, let alone what's being said in the city?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt there has been some serious mistakes in the way that this has played out. I think he makes a really important point there that there were things that could have been done differently. For example, that 40p top rate of income tax. There was no need to announce that now.
Sure.
The weekend before...
Only butt in, because I think people genuinely will be quite shocked that Julian Jessup said that as well.
Yeah.
And he's a director of the Institute of Economic Affairs whose mantra, philosophy and thing this is all about. Even he said the timing was inept.
Exactly. Especially as well as it was just before the Labour Party conference weekend. It sort of gave them this own goal. But also, it's not going to be introduced anyway until April next year. So announcing it now merely gives them what we're seeing, a sort of rising within the Conservative Party of these rising tensions. So there are current whispers going on that some Conservative MPs are interacting with Labour MPs to try and stop this from going through.
I've read that, and the Telegraph have done a big bit on it, and I frankly thought that was probably nonsensical. But what I do think, and we talked about it a little earlier, is that there are a number of people. I mean, Mel Stride is one of them, who is the Conservative chair of the Treasury Select Committee, and a big Rishi Sunak backer are basically saying, look, he was right then and you are wrong now. But that's out there for... I mean, I think the idea of Tory backbenchers linking up with Labour seems to me to be quite crazy. But here's the political point. You and I established earlier on in our first conversation that on a lot of the measures we are as one. Duncan agrees with some of the measures, not all of them. Jessup obviously agrees with all of those as well. But the challenge now for Liz Truss is if she changes her mind, she's dead in the water. If she doesn't change her mind, she's potentially dead in the water.
The stakes are so much higher now than I think that she can imagine. She cannot do a U-turn on this. Not only because then people will associate the loss of control of our finances with these sort of economic principles, and it might even be potentially decades until another government would even test the water to implement them again. So her doing a U-turn now is absolute nerve.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it was so, we played that little clip, because right at the beginning of it, Alan Duncan said, a lot of people within the party have been waiting to do this for ages.
Yeah.
And there's commonality upon that point. It was all about timing.
Yeah, it was all about timing. And we've seen also with the ONS figures, it wasn't all the government to blame, I don't think, here in their timing. So we had ONS figures predicting that we would be in a recession second quarter. And only just this week it's come out that, in fact, we were not in a recession. Instead of 0.1, it was 0.2. And then, as we said earlier, the Bank of England should have been raising interest rates gradually over time, rather than what we're seeing now, which is a sort of dangerous situation of increasing hikes very rapidly, very quickly, and meaning people can't keep up.
There's also a lot of people out there, and John Redwood is one of them, who I follow on social media, and he said, oh, yeah, ONS, brilliant. Look at what their predictions were of inflation last time and demanding action on borrowing, this, that and the other. Neither the ONS or the Office of Budget Responsibility or the Bank of England have a perfect track record. Occasionally, ministers have to be ministers and governments have to govern.
Well, completely. And you know who else hasn't helped this situation at all is the IMF, who decided to weigh in earlier this week in saying that what these tax cuts were doing was creating inequality. But that's not at all their position in this. And actually, quite frankly, I think they should apologise to us, because that would have also pushed down the value on the pound at a time when we were experiencing market volatility. I
stuck my head above the parapet on that particular one, and I was discussing it with old mate of mine, Mark Seddon, who's on the left. Labour Party man, used to edit Tribune magazine, and we were mulling over whether it was actually ultra-vires outside of the responsibilities of the IMF. I mean, if we go to the IMF cap in hand, as Labour had to in 1976, they can say, you can have money if you do this, this, this and this. But to intervene and say, we're not quite sure that what you're doing now is right, seemed to me to be against the rules.
I completely agree. I think it was pretty outrageous, actually. And they didn't say it to Ireland, for example, when they decided to cut their top rate of tax to 40%. So I don't know why they're saying it now. You know, that's not their role. And it did have implications on our sterling.
Great to see you. Thanks for coming in, both at 12 o'clock and just now. You've really cast a great deal of thoughtful light on these matters, not just as a young thinking person, but as someone who really does know what she's talking about. I hope you come back and see us again soon.
Of course, of
Brilliant.
course.
Thank you very much indeed. That was Lettice there, Bromovsky, giving her views on the budget and other matters.